Welcome back, students, to another video on the Russian Revolution, area of study 2. In this video, I am going to look at the new economic policy, which was introduced in March 1921 and ran right through to the end of our course in 1927. It was a capitalist economic policy, and it was, what you need to understand as well, is that it was a retreat from the communist economic policies associated with war communism. In particular, it put an end to grain requisitioning, which had led to a number of insurrections and revolts within Russia and almost led to the Bolsheviks losing their authority and control. So anyway, let's get into it. The causes of the NEP, as I was just saying, there were a number of revolts that were occurring around this time, and at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Lenin proposed the introduction of the NEP because of the famine, which had killed 5 million people, the grim economic situation in Russia as a result not only of the Civil War but of World War I as well. So you always need to remember that the Russians had been fighting war from July, August 1914 right up until 1921. So 7 years of war which had decimated the Russian economy, Russian industry and agriculture, and had led or contributed to the famine amongst other things. So with the famine, as I was saying before, it led to a number of uprisings and revolts. The Tambov Rising, you can see there in 1920 being a very famous and significant one, a peasant uprising, almost 20,000 peasants in the Tambov Rising, insurrecting against Bolshevik rule. The workers' opposition also arose at this time, and that was led by Alexandra Kollontai and another key Bolshevik leader. And the workers' opposition criticised the Bolsheviks and the way the Bolsheviks were running the economy, as well as, and perhaps most significantly, the Kronstadt Rising, when the Kronstadt sailors, they revolted against Bolshevik rule and demanded re-election of the Soviets, demanded an end to grain requisitioning, and so forth. Lenin saw all of these factors and he realised something had to change. Otherwise, the Bolsheviks were going to not hold on to power. So what he did was he convinced the Bolshevik Party to introduce a number of key policies, which we know as the new economic policy. They were: central economic control was to be relaxed, the requisitioning of grain was to be abandoned and replaced by a tax in kind. And this tax in kind was a progressive tax, so the more well-off, richer peasants paid more than the poorer peasants. But it was a set tax, so the peasants knew how much they had to pay. So when they paid that tax, and the tax was paid in grain, they could then hold on to whatever grain they had produced above that tax. So the peasants were allowed to keep their food surpluses, and then they could sell this grain for a profit. Public markets were to be restored, and money was reintroduced as a means of trading. All of these policies, we will see they were successful, but they did lead to a re-emergence of capitalism, and a number of, within Russia, and a number of Bolshevik leaders were not happy about this. Many Bolshevik leaders thought war communism was great, and that war communism should be the economic policy that the Bolsheviks should continue to implement within Russia in order to create a communist society. Lenin, however, being a very pragmatic leader, realised that the Bolsheviks would only be able to create a communist society if they held on to power, and war communism was not helping them to do that. So he did stand up at the 10th Party Congress, and he presented various speeches, and what I have here is an excerpt from one of these speeches arguing for the new economic policy. And he said, why must we replace surplus appropriation, i.e. grain requisitioning, by a tax? Surplus appropriation implied confiscation of all surpluses and establishment of a compulsory state monopoly. We could not do otherwise, for our need was extreme, i.e. during the Civil War. The exchange is an incentive, a spur to the peasant. The proprietor can and will surely make an effort in his own interest when he knows that all his surplus produce will not be taken away from him and that he will only have to pay a tax which should, whenever possible, be fixed in advance. So what Lenin was trying to achieve here was an increase in grain production and a surplus in grain production so that there was enough food for the people in the cities, the workers in the cities, there was enough food for the peasants, there was enough food to feed the army, and then there being enough food, then it will put an end to famine and obviously various insurrections and uprisings. The basic thing is to give the small farmer an incentive and a spur to till the soil. We must adapt our state economy to the economy of the middle peasant, which we have not managed to remake in 3 years and will not be able to remake in another 10. Okay, so as I was referring to before, there were disagreements over the introduction of the NEP. The Bolsheviks disagreed over the introduction of the NEP. In particular, Trotsky and Preobrensky feared that the introduction of the capitalist economic policies associated with the NEP would endanger the creation of a socialist state in Russia and take Russian society or revive a capitalist state within Russia. And that's what the Bolsheviks did not want. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Lenin did a few things in order to firstly introduce the NEP and also impose his authority over the party and put an end to dissenting voices within the party. So he introduced a resolution on party unity, condemning factionalism and factions, groups within a party itself. So for example, perhaps one that you have read about or come across, the left Bolsheviks who were critical of some of Lenin's policies in the past, for example, the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I believe, as well as the initial introduction of state capitalism when the Bolsheviks first got into power. So this resolution on party unity put an end to all factionalism, the forming of groups with a particular complaint as disloyal, and threatened those who did this with immediate expulsion from the party. This, along with another resolution condemning the workers' opposition, that group set up by Alexandra Kollontai, to the brutalities of war communism, stifled criticism of the NEP within the party. And the final factor which led many Bolsheviks to agree to the introduction of the NEP was that the key economic expert or leader within the Bolshevik party, Bukharin, he actually supported it. And you can see that there. So Bukharin's the leading Bolshevik economist. Support for the NEP also stopped any further dissent over the NEP within the party. So Bukharin was the expert. If Bukharin agreed with it, then it must be okay. Okay, so what were the consequences of the NEP? Broadly speaking, it was a success. It did lead to an increase in industrial production, and it did lead to an increase in grain production. And I've got a couple of stats here for you to have a look at. So, for example, grain harvests increased from 37.6 million tonnes in 1921 to 77.8 million tonnes in 1926. So, near the end of war communism, and by 1926, with the NEP policies, grain production had almost doubled, or had more than doubled, in a 5-year period, putting into the famines and so forth. Coal production also increased from 8.99 million tonnes in 1921 to 27.6 million tonnes in 1926. And steel production also increased from 169.2 thousand tonnes in 1921 to 3,130.9 thousand tonnes in 1926. All these stats I got from David Christian, Power and Privilege. And you can use them in your responses if you get a question about the NEP, and you always want evidence to support whatever points you may make in your responses. If you're making a point about the success of the NEP, then you could include these stats. Okay, other consequences of the NEP. So, a negative consequence from a Bolshevik perspective was that it created a new class of rich peasants called NEPMEN who profited from the grain trade. So, the Bolsheviks had attacked the kulaks during war communism, and it inadvertently created a group to replace them, the NEPMEN. It also led to the scissors crisis of 1923. And what the scissors crisis was when manufactured goods became very, very expensive, and agricultural products and grain became less expensive. And what that meant was that the peasants were making less money. They had less money to buy manufactured goods to help them with their grain production, and as a consequence, it was feared they would start hoarding their grain in order to drive up prices, which would then lead to famine. How was it fixed? It was fixed by controlling the prices of industrial and manufactured goods, so regulating the prices so that they were so that the prices were reduced, so that peasants had enough to buy what they needed. I do have a quote here about the scissors crisis, and I'm just going to bring that up right now, and it is from Reinventing Russia. And the scissors crisis itself, the term, the phrase was invented by Trotsky, and I'll just read this quote. So, in a figurative way, Trotsky likened the problem created by the widening gap between industrial and agricultural prices to the open blades of a pair of scissors, which needed to be squeezed and brought closer together. The squeeze to close the blades was quickly implemented through the introduction of price controls in the industrial and manufacturing centres. And if you have a look at the graph up here that I have, it shows the dropping agricultural prices over this period of time in 1923, middle of 1922 up to late 1923, and the increase in the cost of industrial goods. And you can see that by October 1923, right there, this is, I presume, when the price controls started to get implemented, and then agricultural prices started going up and industrial prices started going down. Okay, and the final consequence of the new economic policy was that the Bolsheviks were able to retain control of most of Russia's industry, even though trade and agriculture had slipped into private hands. So the big industrial factories and so forth, the government still owned them. So it did not become a total capitalist economy with the introduction of the NEP. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now about the NEP. So the first one is from the HCPSU, and I've just given a summary of its key point there. So according to the HCPSU, the NEP was a temporary retreat on economic policy before returning to the harsh economic policies of the war communism kind. And the quote is here. It was this kind of temporary retreat that Lenin effected by the new economic policy. Reporting to the 4th Congress of the Communist Internationale on the reasons that prompted the introduction of NEP, Lenin plainly said, "In our economic offensive, we ran too far ahead. We did not provide ourselves with an adequate base, and so it was necessary to make a temporary retreat to secure the rear. that temporary retreat was the introduction of the NEP. Our second historical interpretation is from Orlando Figes. In summary, he argues that Lenin saw the NEP not as a temporary policy, but as a means to achieve socialism. He believed the existence of the market and private trade was necessary for socialism to survive. And Figes' quote, "As Lenin saw it, the NEP was more than a temporary concession to the market in order to get the country back on its feet. But in the main, he saw the market regulated by the state and gradually socialised through cooperatives as the only way to socialism." Okay, so that is my video on the new economic policy. I hope you have found it useful for your study of the Russian Revolution, area of study 2, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.